In 2017, my colleague Chris Southcott and I, Martha Dowsley, explored an interesting demographic phenomenon in the Arctic and published a paper on it in the journal Polar Geography. This phenomenon is called female flight, and it refers to the migration of women. Other researchers have found that lots of young women are leaving small Native Alaskan and Greenlandic communities for larger centers. This type of movement is called stepping stone migration, and it's common around the world. That is, people move from villages to towns, and from towns to small cities, and then from small cities to larger cities. But in Arctic indigenous homelands, migration is heavily skewed towards young women. Researchers attribute this to the demographic transition and urbanization. As women receive more education, which is often only available in larger centers, they enter the workforce there and often work in urban, white-collar jobs. This leads them to have fewer children than previous generations, lowering birth rates and slowing or stopping population growth. But in Alaska, the effects are pronounced. There are more women than men of the same age in larger cities. And in smaller communities, the changes are more far-reaching than just the dating scene. We see irregularities in both age ratios and in sex ratios. Men can't find female partners because there are so few, resulting in fewer new families being formed. Schools are closing for lack of children, and a disproportionately large amount of work goes undone because it is often the more energetic women who migrate. But men are part of the demographic transition too. Why aren't they moving to larger centers? Well, Native Alaskan and Greenlandic men tend to be more involved in harvesting from the land. Their fishing and hunting activities require local geographic knowledge and years of experience. And so their skills and the food they harvest are highly valued culturally and economically. And so they have more reason to stay in their home community. Of course, Arctic indigenous women also value their culture and perform traditional activities, but these traditions are more focused on the settlement and less on the land. So they're more transferable to new geographic locations. Plus, for urban women, there's always vacation time for a trip home, and migration is not always permanent if there's a good reason to go back. I wondered, is female flight an inevitable part of the demographic transition for Arctic indigenous communities? Do women have to leave home? Or are there other ways for them to participate in the modern wage economy and fulfill their professional interests without sacrificing home and culture? I wanted to find out if female flight was happening in Nunavut and what the situation there might add to this discussion. So I asked my friend Chris Southcott to help me look at the Canadian census data. He found that small Nunavut communities were growing more slowly than large ones, but they're still growing, unlike the Alaskan villages where female flight is happening. But Chris didn't find an obvious decline in Nunavut, nor did he find any obvious differences in the number of males and females in the villages. Statistically, it just doesn't look like female flight is happening in Nunavut. Chris and I had two hypotheses to explain this. First, Nunavut is maybe not as far along in the demographic transition, meaning women there are not as engaged in the wage economy and are having more children. Or two, the second hypothesis, maybe Nunavut is developing, but along a different path that doesn't encourage female flight. I decided to go to Nunavut and ask the women about this because I wanted to know if female flight might be happening in the near future. I visited two Baffin Island villages, Clyde River, which is also called Kangiktigapik, and has a population of about 1,000 people, and Kikatarjuak, population about 600. Both are fly-in communities, not accessible by road, and they have employment rates of about 50%. Harvesting food from the land is common, and Inuktitut is the first language in most households. I talked to the women about their travels to other places, plans to move in the future, and reasons for moving away or staying put. A total of 250 women participated in the study. Only about a third of Kikatarjuak women had ever left the community, and about 3/4 of Clyde River women had. So about half of the groups had gone out just for medical reasons, since few services are available at home. About 10% of the women had traveled out just for education, while 4% said they had left for a job. These low numbers are kind of surprising because education and work are the leading reasons for female flight in Alaska and Greenland and for migration internationally. When asked if they might consider leaving for education somewhere else in Nunavut, 35% of the women in the study said yes, but only 25% said they would leave for a job elsewhere in Nunavut. And only about 10% were interested in potentially leaving the territory for a job or education down south. Their reasons for not wanting to leave, or what we call anchor factors, were focused mostly on family, which could include both social and cultural reasons. These data show that women in Kikatarjuak and Clyde River are not motivated to move by economics. They're somewhat interested in pursuing education, but their relationships with their families trump both of these. Chris and I compared these data against our hypotheses. The first hypothesis, that Nunavut is not as far along in the demographic transition as Alaska and Greenland, We considered carefully. We found that the evidence is true. Nunavut is further behind Alaska and Greenland in development, but it's already at a point where we could see female flight already occurring in Alaska and Greenland. Social networks could be another barrier that's stopping migration. Networks provide migration assistance by giving social and economic support to newcomers. People move to places where they know people. This is why migration tends to be in that stepping stone process. You're more likely to know people in geographic proximity to you. Nunavut women all know a lot of people in Iqaluit, but they still aren't really moving there. So hypothesis 1 didn't seem to be explaining anything. What if we looked at this all wrong? Maybe demographic transition theory is not able to explain the situation in Nunavut. We felt that there might be 5 factors that could be contributing towards a different path to development. The first is education. Informal cultural education is best done at home, so it's an anchoring factor. Formal education in larger centers is a pull factor for women in Alaska. But in our case study, we found that Nunavut Arctic College has done a great job of visiting all the communities to provide programs on a rotating schedule. And so people can access quite a lot of useful formal and informal education right at home. They don't need to migrate. Second, technology is more advanced now than it was when Greenland and Alaska started to see female flight. The internet now allows women in Nunavut to access lots of things that were not possible before. Third, the economy in Nunavut is supported by the federal government. There are not a lot of jobs. Employment is only about 50%. This is the same across the territory, so work opportunities are not really greater in one place or another. And the social and cultural barriers of moving out of the territory down south might be prohibitive, even if there is more work available there. Fourth, many people in Nunavut are involved in the subsistence economy. This involves the sharing of harvested country food, which perpetuates relationships with animals and with other people, maintaining cultural heritage and social relationships. Giving this up to engage more in the market economy is not seen as desirable for many people. And the last reason may be that social conditions and agency play a role. Nunavummiut do not feel powerless over social problems in their home communities. There are government programs that provide people with options, so individuals don't feel that migration will necessarily help them better deal with problems they may have. They can access help at home in many cases. And for people that want to help, there's lots of programs that they can get involved with to help their communities. So Chris and I decided that hypothesis 2 makes more sense. This recognizes the greater number of options available to women in smaller communities today than in the past decade. And this may not be pressuring women into female flight as it did in Alaska and Greenland. And so we conclude in our paper with some recommendations to support this idea of an alternate path through the demographic transition. First, internet connection is critical to support everything else. With great internet, people can receive an education and work remotely. Their geographic distance no longer matters as much. Second, policy and funding supports for social programs and flexibility in work arrangements can support the subsistence economy and other cultural activities that make life in remote Arctic communities so enjoyable. These recommendations would allow Inuit and Nunavut lots of individual and communal agency as their territory develops. They could pick their own life path that is economically anchored in both subsistence and markets economies, and they could use technology to shrink social distances while maintaining their physical and cultural presence on their traditional lands.